This is Fjord. All along Norway's shoreline, these lengthy, deep, and narrow trenches extend like inverse rivers, carrying salt water and sea life from the North Atlantic to the interior of the country, creating unique conditions for both human and non-human life. Following the last ice age, vast glacial sheets, hundreds to thousands of meters thick, began slowly melting in the Gulf Stream. This melting ice carved these fjords into Norway's uniquely long coastline of 29,000 kilometers, second only to the many islands of Canada, although without the fjords it would have been only about a tenth of that length. Around 10,000 BC, as the glacial ice continued to retreat, humans began to migrate north into the land which is now Norway, drawn by promising conditions for hunting and fishing. Although some people continued further north, the majority of the population stayed and remains in southern Norway, preferring its relatively docile climate and finding fertile land for farming in the Oslofjord region. In fact, warmed by the Gulf Stream, southern Norway has the furthest north fruit orchards in all of Europe. Travel was difficult in early Norway, with the fjords and intervening mountains keeping villages largely isolated. Even where there were roads, they were often long, steep, and narrow, which made trade difficult. This led to a lot of variety between these hamlets, with different dialects and cultural subgroups emerging, as well as requiring families to work together and share resources to survive. This old ethic of working together for the common good is reflected in Norway's socialist culture to this day. In the late 8th century, a particularly famous Norwegian group emerged, the Vikings. Rather than trying to make do on scarce resources along the fjords like their predecessors, they sailed beyond them with the best of contemporary ships and weaponry, and an attitude to conquer. For the next 3 centuries, they raided and terrorized monasteries and villages across the UK and the Northern Atlantic, bringing home slaves and riches from their exploits. Vikings believed they could bring things with them after death, and for this reason chieftains were often buried with many of their spoils, ranging from jewelry and weapons to entire ships. This has made the Viking period an archaeological goldmine, with much of the buried artifacts preserved nearly how they looked 1,300 years ago. The Vikings were pagans, worshipping traditional Norse gods, and tried to quell attempts at Christianization, which they viewed as heretic. Nevertheless, Christian monks and missionaries were active in the region throughout the Viking Age. A couple of Norwegian kings attempted a religious shift toward Christianity in the 10th century, but they did not find widespread success until the rule of Olav Haraldsson in 1015. King Haraldsson passed church laws, destroyed pagan temples, built churches, and created an institution of priests. Norse chieftains, fearing the implications of his rule, had Haraldsson banished from Norway in 1028 and later executed when he tried to re-enter the country. However, by this point, popular belief had already shifted in favor of Christianity. By the 12th century, Viking power had largely diminished, and churches were being built across the country. As luxury materials were hard to source and harder to transport across this terrain, the majority of Norway's religious buildings were crafted from cheap and plentiful lumber, as opposed to the grand churches and castles of stone made elsewhere in Europe at this time. Over the following century, thousands of these wooden churches, known as stave churches, were constructed, but with the frequency of fires in the region, only a few dozen survive today. Stave churches are supported by stout pine poles, or staves, and are slathered in a coat of black tar to protect them from the elements. Several of these churches are adorned not only with crosses and Christian motifs, but also with complex carvings depicting pagan mythology, as many people of the time held both faiths. The stylized dragons atop this church are thought to have served like gargoyles, protecting the worshippers from evil spirits. This church, also from the 12th century, is an exception to the typical stave churches. Known as the Ness Kyrkruin, it is located at the junction of the Glomma and Vorma rivers, and was originally built as a Romanesque long church, although it was extended into a cruciform layout in 1697. The grounds have also been used as a cemetery. Its resilience was tested in 1567 when it was set fire by Swedish militants, but it was repaired and remained intact until it caught fire again when struck by lightning in 1854, causing it to lose its roof and wood trim. The Kyrkruin was finally restored in the 1920s, with weather-resistant pews brought in for continued prayer and contemplation, and it remains one of very few well-preserved stone churches in Norway. Across the country to the west, another Romanesque stone long church was built shortly after the Nestkirk, although this one has seen even more changes over the centuries. Now a cathedral, it is located in the center of the port city of Bergen, and burned down no fewer than 5 times before being built close to its modern appearance in the mid-1600s. The cathedral is most famous for its involvement in the Anglo-Dutch War of 1665, where a stray cannonball from a sea skirmish became embedded in the cathedral's exterior wall and remains there to this day. In the 13th century, long before this church became a famed cathedral, Norway was just entering its golden age, at peace and finding newfound prosperity through Bergen's economic success. Established as a trading settlement a couple of centuries prior, business in Bergen had attracted the attention of the king, who established it as Norway's first official capital. The royalty built their residence here in the mid-1200s, creating a large stone fortress now known as Bergenhus, containing many interior buildings with diverse functions. The most famous of these buildings is Hakon's Hall, which is by far the largest secular stone building in Norway from the Middle Ages. Bergen's success relied heavily on its location and abundant natural resources. A large island sheltered the city, and plenty of inlets carved by the surrounding fjords provided a safe natural harbor for ships. This made it the perfect meeting point for cod fishermen from the north to do business with traders from elsewhere in Europe. The only missing ingredient was skilled merchants to broker the deals, but a solution soon arose for this as well: North German expatriates with experience in international business. These Germans built a colorful waterfront trading center known as Bryggen, or the Wharf, for drying, storing, and advertising the codfish. While business prospered in the west, King Håkon V decided to move from Bergen east to Oslo, and with him moved the rest of the nation's elites. He cemented Oslo as Norway's new capital by ordering construction of the Akershus fortress over the local harbor in 1299, which was never successfully besieged by a foreign adversary, although it was diplomatically ceded to Nazi Germany in World War II. Akershus remains a military base to this day, although much of the historic ramparts are now open to tourism. Back in Bergen, the German-Norwegian business alliance continued booming until 1349, when an English ship carrying the Black Death brought a sudden end to Norway's prosperity. Spreading rapidly and without treatment, this plague took out nearly 2/3 of Norway's population within a year. The subsequent reduction in taxes weakened the king's position and made it easy for Denmark to begin taking political control over Norway, although the Danish did not fully solidify their rule until the 16th century. Despite this foreign rule, Norway found another economic victory in the 1500s with the introduction of the water-driven saw. Lumber had always been abundant in the country, but without the ability to efficiently process it, transportation was difficult. The fjords once again played an important role in this, providing the hydropower needed to operate the saws. Most of this wood was sold to the Netherlands, and many historic parts of Amsterdam are built from Norwegian lumber from this period. As these new lumber mills were popping up along the fjords, the German merchants in Bergen were negotiating a deal with their overseers in Denmark. This deal allowed Bergen to form its own state with membership in the mighty Hanseatic League, an exclusive alliance of cities across northern Europe which worked together for freer, safer, and more profitable trade. Bergen was reintegrated into Norway at the end of the Hanseatic period in the 1600s. at which time it was the largest city in the country, more than double the size of Trondheim and Oslo combined. Even after its heyday, this Hanseatic success brought long-term benefit to Bergen, which is still second in size only to Oslo and remains a tourist destination and working port, providing refuge for both cruise and commercial oil ships. Norway began to push for independence after King Christian IV of Denmark rebuilt downtown Oslo closer to the Akershus fortress after a fire and renamed the city Christiania after himself. However, the sentiment wasn't widespread until the Norwegian economy collapsed after Denmark-Norway gave many resources to backing France in the Napoleonic Wars. A national assembly was called by the Crown Prince, Christian Frederick, whereupon a constitution for an independent Norway was drafted. The Constitution was signed on May 17, 1814, with the intent to split Norway's power between King Frederick and a new body of parliament. However, just weeks later, Sweden invaded Norway and coerced a union with the country. Despite this, King Frederick and the Constitution remained, and May 17th is still celebrated as Norway's Constitution Day. In 1824, under King Charles III John, work commenced on the Norwegian royal palace, which ended up taking 25 years to complete and blowing away the initial budget. Economic issues didn't only affect the palace, of course. Hoping for a better life, many rural Norwegians began immigrating to North America in the 1820s, and the mass exodus continued over the next century. By 1830, the population of Christiania had surpassed that of Bergen, and continued to climb while Bergen's leveled off. However, the Western Norwegian influences stayed strong, with 1843 seeing the birth of Edvard Grieg, Norway's most famous composer, who spent his life just outside of Bergen. Grieg mixed Norwegian folk influences with the contemporary Romantic style to create unique piano and vocal pieces inspired by both nature and culture. In 1858, the Western Fjords aided the Norwegian people once again, this time providing the waterway for the first scheduled ferry service. Although now used mainly by tourists, ferries in the fjords are and were essential to locals who finally had a means to easily navigate from their rural homelands to the nearby cities for both business and pleasure. The late 1800s brought another key mode of transportation to Norway as well, the coast-to-coast railway. Previously deemed too difficult due to the terrain, the Røros line from Trondheim to Christiania was completed in 1877, followed by the famed Bergen line to the capital in 1909. As well as making transportation of people and goods vastly easier, these rail lines provide incredible scenery of the mountains and fjords, and today the 8-hour Bergen line is considered by many to be the most scenic ride in all of Europe. In June 1905, a parliament vote dissolved the Norwegian Union with Sweden, and Norway finally gained permanent independence, and soon thereafter renamed their capital city back to the now familiar Oslo. The fjords and surrounding waterfalls were harnessed for their power once again, this time in providing hydroelectricity. In 1913, Norway became the second country after Finland to grant women the right to vote. Around this time, the city of Oslo hired a famous sculptor, Gustav Vigeland, to create art for the municipality in exchange for a small stipend and place to live. Vigeland is most famous for his sculpture garden in Frogner Park, which features 600 bronze and granite figures, each nude and unique. His sculptures are symbolic, depicting the seasons and cycle of life. Here 6 giants are seen holding up a fountain as water cascades over them, signifying life's toil. The sculptures culminate in a central monolith, where over 100 bodies reach over each other, struggling skyward. Vigeland died peacefully shortly before the end of World War II, but his sculpture garden in Frogner Park remains a destination for tourists, families, and artists alike. In both World Wars, Norway was officially neutral, but in the First World War, their merchant marines supported the British, and they lost half their fleet to the war. The Second World War hit the country much more directly, with Nazis taking occupation of Norway throughout the war to control access to the North Sea and prevent travel between Britain and the USSR. The exiled Norwegian parliament members and royal family escaped to London, and from there supervised the resistance within Norway remotely. The Norwegian resistance campaign included raids, surveillance, and sabotage, most famously the heavy water sabotage, officially called Operation Gunnerside. Atomic fission had recently been discovered, and in testing its capabilities, a new substance called heavy water was created at a hydro plant in Värmork to moderate the energy of neutrons from radioactive decay. Germans were using the heavy water from this plant in their atomic research program, and to keep the Nazis from building an atomic bomb, Allies rushed to take action in Norway. At first they thought of bombing the plant, but that was deemed too difficult, so instead they decided to tackle it internally. With the aid of insider Norwegians, British engineers and commandos were dropped in via glider to assault the plant and destroy as much of it as possible. Unfortunately, the gliders crashed, and the troops were captured. But another group of brave Norwegians gave it a second attempt, under the guise of being students on a skiing vacation. They climbed the cliffs below the plant, sneaked in, and set explosives that destroyed the heavy water production machinery and inventory. Having completed their mission, they skied back down the mountain and over 300 kilometers east, where they safely reached the border of Sweden. Following World War II, Norway had a legal purge, with over 50,000 people sentenced for collaborating with the Germans, and 25 of them executed. In 1949, Norway also abandoned its traditional policy of neutrality and became a founding member of NATO. Oil prospecting started in the North Sea in 1966, and in 1969, Phillips Petroleum struck gold at Ekofisk, now one of the 10 largest known oil fields in the world. This created many new jobs and boosted the economy through taxation, but it wasn't all good news. Ekofisk had a major pipeline blowout in 1977, releasing countless tons of crude oil into the ocean over the 8 days it took to fix. 3 years later, one of their rigs capsized, leading to over 100 deaths. Regulations increased, and by 1990, Norway became Europe's largest producer of oil, and shortly thereafter, the second largest in the world. It's hard not to see the irony of such a pristine and environmentally conscious country also being at the forefront of the oil industry. Nowadays, Norway mixes these historic influences with the technology of the 21st century. Looking downtown from the rooftop plaza of the Marble Opera House, you can see how the ancient Oslo Fjord has been surrounded by modern ships, sculptures, glassy high-rises, and thoroughfares. As busy as this roadway is, it was actually much busier a couple decades ago, as most of the automotive traffic has been replaced by subsidized public transport or moved underground. Past this commotion, the historic fortress of Akershus still stands proudly watching over the city, and Viking-era buildings are displayed on the nearby island of Big Doy as a tribute to generations past. In this brief look through time, it's amazing to see all the human progress that these fjords enabled, and clear that Norway's history would not have been the same without them. But perhaps the most amazing effect of the fjords on us isn't practical, but psychological. Although I had chosen to visit Norway to see a friend, and not specifically for the fjords, as I rode the Mostroen ferry down Osterfjord on this blustery October morning, it became clear to me why people would travel from across the globe to see them. Mountain crags, lushly treed and precipitous, dropped steeply into these narrow seawater channels. Birds glided overhead, and distant snow-capped peaks foretold the changing seasons. Originating from that snow, countless waterfalls cascaded down the side of the mountains before plunging into the fjord channel like an oceanic Yosemite Valley. Spending time in these fjords reminded me how small we are as humans compared to the vastness of nature, and yet how big a difference we can make by treating it well. With continued care, I know these fjords can continue to provide beauty and resources for humans and all the other species who make their home here, long after our current age has been added to the history books.